In education, assessments have gotten a bad reputation, and for good reason. If I'm honest, I hope that I'm not the only teacher out there that has tried renaming quizzes, tests, assessments to things like check for understandings and check-ins and things like that, just to try and make it a little less weighty for students. But the truth is that assessments are often weighty and negative and stressful and frustrating for students. And I hope that they don't have to be. I don't think that they have to be. I was recently just finished a deep dive into the book Empower by John Spencer and AJ Giuliani. It's a fantastic book. I strongly recommend it. If you're interested in flipping your classroom, this is the best book I have read in terms of a balanced approach to innovative, emerging teaching strategies and structures, while also kind of keeping some of those things like rubrics and things that can be very helpful. John Spencer and AJ Giuliani have this corner of the book on assessments that maybe is the most beneficial section of the book for me in terms of how it's reframed my ideas of education and how I teach. Although they can be so stressful, I think the good news is that they don't have to be. Assessments don't have to be weighty, and they don't have to be negative. They don't have to be stressful. They can actually be a source of joy, and they can be individualistic. They can be diverse. They can be catered. They can be student-led, and dare I say it, even more effective. Today I'm drinking Multitasker Blend by 25-8 Coffee. It is a little bit caramely and chocolatey in its aroma, and it's a bit nippy, malty, and caustic. The slight bitterness is actually quite wonderful. 25-8 Coffee is an awesome Texas-based coffee company made for educators by educators. We get coffee, don't we? 15% of all profits go to supplies for teachers. Check out 25-8 Coffee at 258coffee.com or hop on Twitter and check out at 258coffee. They are always posting education relevant content on their Twitter page, as well as things about coffee. To be fair, assessments can be good things. The way that we normally do them even could be good things. Routines aren't bad, and I actually think routines for assessments can be super helpful. I mean, if you think about it, the way that I've been teaching for a few years now has kind of been this routine of kind of a pre-assessment, and then kind of just like a check for understanding. What do they already know coming into this, right? And then doing lots of goal setting and exit tickets every day, and then kind of at the end of units doing a summative type of assessment to figure out what they actually learned from their pre to the post. You know, these are good things. These routines aren't so bad. And so before I rail on assessments and talk about all of the positive things that I've learned about how assessments can be through reading this book, I do want to just say, routines aren't bad. We've landed where we are for a reason. Think about this. Summative assessments are a type A, efficient and effective approach to determine if someone knows something. If you want to test the entire country and figure out what everybody knows, there's a reason that a summative, classic, traditional assessment is the way that we go, because it's one size fits all, and it kind of makes sense to me. You and I both know that we need every second of instructional time that we can get our hands on, so an efficient test or an efficient assessment is definitely one that we can find valuable. All of that to say, I do want to kind of go into some emerging assessment practices that I'm reading about that I'm pretty excited about as well. But let's first define it. John Spencer and AJ Giuliani break down assessments this way. Assessments are useful for what students already know, so that's prior knowledge, what students don't know, areas for improvement, what students want to master, those are their goals, and what students will do to improve. So an action plan based on their goals. Now, at this point in reading, I have already gotten to the point where I'm like, well, I'm not doing enough. I already have room to improve. Just those four considerations are already like, I'm not always considering those four things. That's fantastic. So it should be said that it's necessary to consider reframing how students see assessments, because even as an educator, I'm forced to reframe how I see assessments. I was rewatching Mark Grober's TED Talk. If you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. I'll link it below. He talks about Mario and Super Mario Brothers, and talks about assessments and learning and stuff. But I was reminded of how important it is to reframe failure for our students, reframe the learning process, and reframe assessments for kids. Assessments are everywhere. That's the first thing that we need to make sure we point out. When our students play video games and they make mistakes or don't win or whatever, depending on which game they're playing, they just give up. They buy a $60 video game and they just give up when they lose. No, they regroup and they figure it out, and they go back to the game and start figuring out, what do I got to do to be better at this game, right? I live in Broncos country here in Denver, Colorado. And on Monday mornings during the football season, every single day, every single Monday or Tuesdays if we have a Monday night game, what kind of conversation do you think is happening all around our school? Oh, did you watch the Broncos game? Oh yeah, this is what happened. Oh yeah, that's not why. So the reason we lost, unfortunately, that is the common conversation, the reason we lost. But anyway, what are we talking about? We're talking about assessments. That's what those are. We are assessing how the Broncos played and why they did or did not do well on a given game. And thirdly, if you want to think about assessments in the real world, have you ever met a baseball fan? Pretty much says it by itself. They're crazy about statistics and numbers and all this stuff. I mean, I've sat next to people at baseball games, watching at Coors Field, watching the Rockies, and seen guys like filling out like all of the balls, strikes, strikeouts, like writing this all stuff down on a piece of paper. That's pretty dedicated. So if you've ever hung out with a baseball player, then you know what I'm talking about, or a baseball fan, because they're assessing people constantly, and they're doing it with data and information and math. Something that I regularly remind my students about is that failure is just information. It's a phrase I use all the time. Failure is just information. It's just data. It's just information, and it's valuable information. It tells us what we don't know and tells us what our next steps are. Growing up as a skateboarder, I learned very quickly as a kid that if you want to learn a trick on a skateboard, you have to be willing to try and try and try hundreds of times, because something like as simple as a kickflip, which took me years to learn, something like that can be really, really stressful if you're not willing to figure out what's not working and try and improve. So let's talk about the classroom. How can we be thinking differently about assessments in the classroom? First of all, AJ Giuliani and John Spencer point out that assessments can be catered and diverse. There are many different types of assessments. In the book, they give lots of examples. I'm not going to give all those right now because it's a short video, and I strongly recommend you actually go read the book, because the book is way better than what I'm saying right now. In fact, if you have the book or want the book, just stop the video now and just go read it. It's way better than what's going on here. But they can be catered. You can cater assessments to specific learning targets, and they can be diverse. You could have different types of assessments for similar types of learning targets. Assessments are necessary and often quite rewarding. That's really, really helpful to hear, because the last thing I want to do is read a book like this and then hear them say something like, well, assessments, we got to throw them out, forget about it. No, they're really valuable, and we need assessments. They have to happen. And they can often be very rewarding, but it's all about how you frame the assessment process. And if you can find a way to frame it so that it's positive, even when they totally fail it, if you can frame that as a positive, as a means to success, that's good news. Assessments don't have to be teacher directed. This is a new one to me. I don't know, ask yourself about your classroom, but in my classroom, assessments have always been teacher directed. I say set a goal. I say reflect on it. I say take this pre-test. I say take this post-test. I say what type of Kagan structure we're gonna do. It's always me, right? I tell them to do a self-assessment. I tell them to circle their rubrics. I tell them, right? And they don't have to be. One of the things they point out in the book is that you can have student-directed assessments. Students can say, hey, this is what I'm learning about. This is what my goal is, and this is how I'm going to assess that. That's fantastic. Wonderful news. Assessments don't have to be one size fits all, and you don't even have to have all of your students use the same assessment at the same time. Brilliant. I've never, ever considered having students pick their own assessment based on what they're learning and what they think is most effective, and do different ones at the same time. Imagine the feedback you could get by having your students pick different types of assessments, summative and reflections and all this stuff, and then go after the fact and look at what worked and what didn't work, and discuss it as a class and say, we saw some of you guys do multiple choice quizzes, and we saw some of you guys do reflections, and let's talk about what's most effective and what worked well based on what we were trying to achieve in class that day. And then finally, self-assessments, peer assessments, and one-on-one conferencing can be just as influential in determining what students know as a classic than a classic summative post-unit assessment. And dare I say it, for some kids, maybe even more accurate. You know the kids in your classroom that do not test well. And it's always frustrating to hear that when you have a student with amazing potential, incredible creativity, that struggles with taking quizzes and tests. And I almost felt like, as an educator my first few years, I just thought that was a myth. Like, no, they're just lazy or something. But it's true. Quizzes can be tough. And I remember taking a test just a couple years ago as an educator. I was taking a quiz for PD, and I remember being like, I don't understand what they're asking me. And it's just the language of it, right? So imagine our students who struggle with language and struggle with writing and struggle with quizzes and test taking. Imagine giving them the freedom and empowering them to do a self-assessment in a reflective process, or one-on-one conference with you and just talk about it and say, tell me what you know about that, or tell me what you learned during this process. And maybe what we would get is we would give them a chance to use their own language in describing what they've learned. And through that process, maybe what would happen is that we would actually get a better understanding of what those students actually know than if we force them to take a multiple choice or true-false type quiz. Well, that was yet again a wealth of information. I think, at least for me, it was a wonderful, it was so fun to take notes on this. I really enjoyed these chapters, and I really enjoyed challenging my own thoughts in terms of what I do with assessments. And I'm really looking forward to next school year now, when we're all back in the classroom together and I can do some of these new strategies and implement them. My challenge to you is that you do the same. Go for it. Think about, what are the ways that I'm caught in old routines and structures that I'm just doing because I've always done them, or because my educators did them, and what are some ways I can be giving students opportunities to try it out themselves and maybe decide what types of assessments they think work best for them, and how they might be able to assess themselves and each other and conference with teachers, rather than doing the classic summative post-assessment every single time.